Okay, welcome to Promethean Action Saturday night class for March 22nd. This is Tony Papert speaking to you from the Detroit area. Tonight's class is by Susan Kokinda on Trump, Musk, and the U.S. industrial mobilization which won World War II. And just to speak briefly in introducing it, I mean, Donald Trump has promised, as Promethean Action has been fighting for many years, to make the United States into an industrial superpower. And already, with less than 9 weeks into his term, we've seen $2 trillion of new industrial investment into the United States. And Trump has begun to unveil his tariff program, uh, which is a major part of that program to make the United States again into an industrial superpower. Now, many people say it can't be done for various reasons. Tariffs don't work. There are attacks on the computer, on the consumer. It'll collapse the markets. We don't have the manpower. People give all kinds of reasons why they say it won't work, but it will work. It can work. It will work, and it has worked. It worked before. It worked in the industrial mobilization, which won World War II, the U.S. industrial mobilization, which won World War II. This is a story which Susan has studied intensively. And I think if you bear with us through tonight's presentation, be followed by discussion, you'll see that, in fact, it can be done. It will be done. So with that, let me bring on Susan.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Hello, everybody. I think not only can it be done and will it be done, I think it's in the process of actually being done. What I'm going to focus on tonight, or sort of spring off of, is a book entitled Freedom's Forge, which is about the World War II mobilization. Now, a couple of weeks ago, in early March, a Substack post caught the attention of some of my colleagues. It was about the book. The post was entitled Freedom's Forge, The Story of American Business and Industrial Production in World War II. Now, this is one of my favorite books. It does tell the story of the World War II mobilization. Let me share the screen. That's what the book looks like. It centers around two key figures in the World War II mobilization: Bill Knudsen, who was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt to head the government's war production effort, and Henry Kaiser, who stayed in the private sector and whose construction expertise was tapped for the enormous expansion we needed in shipbuilding. But the person who wrote the post, Dominic Cummings, who's a kind of anti-establishment British political figure, he wasn't just looking at this book from the standpoint of history. As you can see on the screen there, he says, this book is one of those read by many involved in the White House Doge project. And he goes on to say that one of the core goals of this entrepreneurial elite, which is trying to change Washington, D.C., is to apply the lessons of America's manufacturing and industrial capacities, gear up to apply the lessons of the Golden Age. And he goes on to say part of this project is a cross between the lessons from this period, World War II, and today's lessons from Silicon Valley and Andreessen's build, build, build. And I'll get back to the significance of that in a minute, for modern technology and advanced manufacturing. So apparently this book is being studied by people who are engaged in this process of build, 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 as well it should be. The author, Arthur Herman, writes a really well-researched and a vivid account of the war production mobilization, which of course is what created the arsenal of democracy and which was seminal to victory in World War II. I'm going to discuss some of the, I don't know if they're the most important, they're my favorite aspects of the book, especially the role of Bill Knudsen. I'm not going to try and give an extensive review of it. I really encourage people to get a copy of it and read it. But before I get into the World War II mobilization story, I want to turn to a speech that J.D. Vance gave earlier this week to the American Dynamism Conference. In fact, this class should probably be entitled Trump, Vance, and Musk and the World War II mobilization. Now, that American Dynamism Conference is interesting because if you noticed, I mentioned earlier, Andreessen's, that Cummings quoted Andreessen's build, build, build for modern technology and advanced manufacturing. He's referring to Mark Andreessen, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and he's the founder of the American Dynamism Conference that Vance spoke at. So Vance's speech there earlier this week, and the fact that he gave it to this audience is extremely important because it reflects the fact that a dialogue about a new language of economics is occurring among significant layers. It's not really new. It's how we used to think about economics. It's the American system of political economy. More profoundly, Vance's speech more profoundly begins to get to the core of Lyndon LaRouche's ideas about the relationship between human creativity, innovation, and physical economic progress. So this also is a very important, Vance's speech is very important, and I encourage people to just go on YouTube and look under American Dynamism and J.D. Vance, and you'll find it. It's only about 20 minutes long, and it really is extraordinary. It actually begins with a reference to John Paul II, whom Vance describes as one of his favorites, or a fan of his encyclical entitled Laborem Exercens. Now, this is a document which Lyndon LaRouche admired and he wrote about extensively. And Vance pretty much began his speech with the following quote, and I'm going to share the screen again. Okay. The top quote is the quote from John Paul II. Through work, man must earn his daily bread and contribute to the continual advance of science and technology, and above all, to elevating unceasingly the cultural and moral level of the society within which he lives. Now, this really was the theme of Vance's speech, that science and technology is fundamental to increasing productivity and advancing living standards. And what Vance said, the second quote there, is real innovation makes us more productive, but it also dignifies our workers. It boosts our standard of living, it strengthens our workforce and the real value of labor. Now, again, I think people should listen to the whole speech because he touches on some very important points, and especially those of you who are familiar with Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers and his discussion of the productive powers of labor and Lyndon LaRouche's advance on that. I think you're going to see a really amazing resonance, more so than I think I've seen in any speech from a major political figure in a very, very long time. Now, it's possible that Vance is one of the people who has read the book Freedom's Forge, because in the speech, he addresses the loss of our industrial base with a reference to shipbuilding. He talks about, and he uses as an example, the incredible production of Liberty ships during World War II, which is one of the focuses of Arthur Herman's book. And Vance makes the point that we have so gutted our shipbuilding industry that one Chinese shipbuilding firm made more ships last year than all of our shipbuilding since World War II. Now, this is something that the Trump administration is addressing. I believe there's an executive order and increasing focus on the fact that we've got to revive actual American shipbuilding. So again, his reference to Liberty ships makes me think that maybe he's one of the people reading Arthur Herman's book. What Vance then does in this speech is he engages in a really Socratic discussion with his audience, because he poses an apparent contradiction. He calls it a tension between the technological optimists, which is pretty much the audience at this American Dynamism conference, a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and others, and the populists, by which he says the people who are trying to protect American jobs. And he takes on this so-called tension, the idea that innovation will cause a loss of jobs in the United States. And he takes the discussion to a different level to identify what the actual root cause of the problems facing both the technological optimists and the average working person is. He makes clear that the real failure is what he calls two conceits of globalization. And I'm going to share the screen again. These are the two conceits that he's talking about. He says that the globalists assume that you can separate the making of things from the design of things. In other words, the globalists think that, the poor countries are just going to make the simple stuff, and the rich countries, because they do the designing and so on, are going to move further up the value chain. That's one thing. And then the second conceit is cheap labor. And he gets really intense on this one. He says American firms got addicted to cheap labor, whether we offshored our industries or we imported cheap labor through immigration. And then he singles out both the United Kingdom and Canada as examples of countries that have massively imported cheap labor. And he makes the point that this has caused a stagnation of productivity. And he just drills down. He says that the problem for American workers is not innovation. It's these two conceits of globalization. And that outsourcing the jobs and cheap labor. And that globalization, outsourcing actual manufacturing, the making of stuff, the fact that we've outsourced that, as well as the cheap labor question. And he makes the point that working people and innovators have the same enemy. And the solution is American innovation, because in the long term, it is technology that increases the value of labor. Then the speech gets even more interesting, because he cites examples of increasing the value of labor. And he says innovations like the American system. I'm going to share the screen again. He doesn't really elaborate on this, but for those of you on this call who are familiar with us, the American system is something we have devoted a great deal of work on. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is the pamphlet which we've produced, What President Trump Can Do with the American System 2.0, which develops the idea in this pamphlet that the actual metric for economic development is physical economic growth driven by creativity and the increasing productive powers of labor. Now, what you see on the other side of the screen is the leaflet that we're going to be taking to Congress next week, when a team of Promethean Action organizers go to Capitol Hill with the mission of talking to as many congressional offices as possible about this new economic language, which is indeed the American system. And if any of you watching this call can still reach out to your senators and congressmen and encourage them to meet with our team when we're up on Capitol Hill, you should do so. Whether we get a meeting with an office or not, we are going to leave this pamphlet and this leaflet for every Senate office and every congressional office, because in a certain sense, we have to be the translators for the Congress of this new language of the American system. But I think it's really fascinating that even though he doesn't really elaborate on it, he says, J.D. Vance says, innovations like the American system. The other innovation he cites is, as an example, Ford's moving assembly line that skyrocketed the productivity of our workers. And this whole question of the automobile industry and how it played a seminal role in the World War II mobilization is going to largely be the focus of this discussion. Now, there's actually much more in Vance's speech, and to me, it's the most fully developed that I've seen of all the speeches and interviews that have been delivered by this administration. But Trump's economic team, whether it's the president himself or Vice President Vance or Scott Bessent or Howard Lutnick or Robert Lighthizer, they really all are speaking with one voice, and they are speaking the language of production, which to many seems like a new language, but again, it isn't. When have you ever heard a Treasury Secretary talk the way Bessent does, about a new Republican Party based on workers? These guys are not using the language of Wall Street. They're not using the language of money. And this is a thoroughly composed offensive on the part of the Trump administration. And we intend to try and magnify it and explain it as much as possible. Barbara Boyd's Saturday Wrap this week goes through some of the current elements of that. So it actually doesn't surprise me that the book Freedom's Forge is a resource for this group, because it very much addresses precisely this new language. Now, 3 years ago, I actually gave a class based on the book, and in particular around the role of Bill Knudsen. So today I'm going to reprise some of that in this new context. Arthur Herman's book goes back and forth between Knudsen and the role of Henry Kaiser and Kaiser's construction company and his amazing construction prowess and the seminal role that he played in shipbuilding construction, which he had not done before. I mean, he came at this as someone who had not been engaged in shipbuilding. And what they built was not only military ships, but also civilian merchant marine ships, which were extremely important because we had to move material around for our allies before the war started. And we also needed to get raw materials into the United States. So the question of shipbuilding was just as important, as what some of us may be more familiar with in terms of the war production. Dominic Cummings, in his coverage of the book, actually calls Kaiser the Elon Musk of his day, in the sense that he's a guy who just builds, and tackles new things all the time. The one lesson I want to draw out from the Kaiser experience from the book before I turn to Bill Knudsen is the following. Kaiser and his team were tasked with creating new shipyards in Oregon and Washington State, something they'd never done before. They had to actually get the shipyards ready within a couple of months so that they could then begin the task of building the ships. And he had to pull together a team to do that. And again, these are people who never built ships. But who did he go to? Well, he actually went out, he reached out to the people who were now in private industry, but had previously worked with him on the hallmark big government projects that he had been involved in, the Grand Coulee Dam and the Boulder Dam. He reached out to people who had gotten their experience working on these great projects, which could not have been built without national funding and national direction. They then took that experience back into private industry until they were called upon once again for a national mission and, joined Kaiser in the shipbuilding projects. Now, I just want to highlight that because it really does underscore the importance of great national projects for the nation. There's been a many decades long backlash against so-called big government, which is really a kind of simple-minded conception. I mean, clearly Elon Musk is cutting all sorts of crap with Doge. and waste, fraud, abuse, and stupid programs should be cut on their merits. But the idea that the government shouldn't do anything or limited government is the way to go is really very simple-minded, because especially when you look at some key great projects like these dams that were built with national funding and national direction, rural electrification, before all of that, the Transcontinental Railroad, and especially the Tennessee Valley Authority. You know, what you see is vital things which uplifted the productivity of the entire nation, but also provided a crucible for training a highly, highly skilled workforce, which, as we then saw with Kaiser, could be called upon when you needed a national mobilization. But let's then turn to Bill Knudsen and why he was chosen by Franklin Roosevelt to head the Office of Production Management. He was called upon by Roosevelt in May 1940. When he was recruited, he was the CEO of General Motors. And frankly, throughout the 1930s, there had been, to use J.D. Vance's term again, a lot of tension between corporate heads like Bill Knudsen and the New Dealers in the Franklin Roosevelt administration. But Knudsen did not hesitate for a second when Roosevelt called upon him. He quit his job. He called Alfred P. Sloan, said, "I'm leaving." Sloan said, "You're crazy. They're going to eat you alive." He said, "My country's calling on me." And he left, and he worked famously for $1 a year. Now, again, this is May 1940. This is 18 months before Pearl Harbor. And I would say, and this book, Freedom's Forge, I think makes very, very clear that this is one of the most important 18 months in modern history. Now, I'm going to show another slide. What you're going to see is a number of slides which are pictures that I took at a traveling exhibit on the World War II mobilization. I think it was about 10 years ago. I saw it at the Yankee Air Museum in Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is at the site of the old Willow Run bomber plant. And I took a bunch of pictures, and I'm going to use some of them in the course of this. The first one, which I will share in a second, tells the story of why Roosevelt picked Bill Knudsen. He originally went to his friend Bernard Baruch because Baruch had actually headed the World War I mobilization, industrial mobilization, which was pretty much a disaster. It was too little, too late, and Baruch knew it. He also was very honest. He said, "I'm too old for this job." But he knew what the failings were in terms of the World War I mobilization, where frankly, most of the industrial material that we created didn't get delivered till around or even after the armistice. So Baruch had sort of an inside idea of what the problems were. So Roosevelt said to him, "Well, if you won't do it, give me the names of 3 people, the top 3 production men in the country who should be considered for this job." And as you can see on the slide there, Baruch said, first Knudsen, second Knudsen, third Knudsen. Now, why did he say that? Because Knudsen was a machine tool genius, as were many people in the auto industry that he came from. And I'm going to come back to this, the question of machine tools and what Lyndon LaRouche called the machine tool principle. Jesse Jones, who was the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and worked very, very closely with Knudsen, described him in the following way. He said, "He seemed to carry in his head a picture of the whole manufacturing business of the United States. And he knew which plant could be enlarged or just retooled." And this was vital because it was absolutely clear that you needed somebody like this in this position. For anybody who was paying attention, it was going to be clear that the United States was going to have to enter the war inevitably, and we were not prepared. here's where we stood. I mean, obviously, we had demobilized after World War I, and you had the Depression. So by the end of the 1930s, the United States was 17th in the world in terms of the size of our military. Countries like Argentina and Hungary had bigger militaries than we did. We had 1,500 planes, and some of them were trainers, and some of them were biplanes left over from World War I. And at the outset of the war, Hitler was already flying 1,500 planes per day. Our steel industry had collapsed. It was at its lowest capacity in 1939 in 20 years, which means in 1939 it was lower than in the earlier phases of the Depression. The estimates of what would be needed for a minimal gear up of aluminum was that we only had 1/4 of aluminum production for just even a minimal gear up. Now, there were people who recognized what a dangerous situation we were in, and I'm going to share the screen again. One of them was the Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall. He attended a meeting in the White House, May 13th, 1940. And even though his boss, the Secretary of War, did not favor an industrial mobilization, Marshall kind of butted in, asked to speak for 3 minutes, and went through how woefully unprepared the United States was, telling Roosevelt if 5 German divisions landed anywhere on the coast, they could go anywhere they wished. Now, that's May 13th, and it was a couple of weeks later that Roosevelt put in the call, called on Baruch, and then put in the call to Bill Knudsen, to take on this absolutely enormous task. So who was Knudsen? Well, he was an immigrant. He came to the United States in 1900 from Denmark at the age of 21. He came from a large family in Denmark and apparently had a decent education and excelled, it was said, in history, mathematics, and languages. He came to the United States with the proverbial shirt on his back and worked his way up through a series of menial jobs and ended up working in a Buffalo bicycle plant, again, with an aptitude for machining and mechanics. That bicycle plant, at a certain point, began producing auto parts for the auto industry. And Henry Ford ultimately bought the plant and brought Bill Knudsen to Detroit, again, recognizing his aptitude in terms of his mechanical ability and his aptitude in terms of machine tools. Knudsen did play a role in the World War I mobilization. One of the few examples of a successful mobilization was Ford's production of the Eagle boats. It was one of the only things where they actually geared up the production fast enough to get it into the war zone and have any use. And then Knudsen later played a role in the development of the Highland Park plant, famously the first assembly line in the world, which really did change the face of American industry and manufacturing. But Knudsen was pretty strong-willed, and so was Henry Ford, and they clashed, and they didn't get along. So at a certain point, he left Ford, went over to GM, became the head of the Chevy division, then president of General Motors. And while he was the head of GM outpaced Ford in auto production, which was really astonishing, because at one earlier point, Ford produced more cars than every other auto producer in the world. But with Knudsen as the head of GM actually outpaced Ford. So, as I said, he was a machine tool genius. Now, what does that mean? Lyndon LaRouche often talked about the machine tool principle. And it really is a very fundamental conception as we think about this new language that the administration, I think, is starting to speak in. So I'm going to share the screen again. This is a quote from Lyndon LaRouche, one of many he wrote about machine tools. But he said, when you're dealing with science, scientific discovery, when you discover an idea, you've got to prove it's true. How can you prove it's right? How can you prove it in nature? So you construct what's called a crucial or proof of principle experiment to prove that nature works the way your discovery says it works. That's called a machine tool principle. Now, when you take the apparatus which you use to construct that experiment, you walk into a guy who designs machine tools. This guy, having seen your experimental device, he probably helped you build the experiment, says, look, I can design a whole group of new kinds of products and new kinds of machine tools on the basis of the discovery which you demonstrated. And that's the way it works. You combine the development of the mind with the development of the products and processes which the mind's discovery of principle has devised. And that's called scientific and technological progress. So that's something that Mr. LaRouche said in 1997. I mean, at the core, machine tools are about transformation. I mean, the machine tool principle transforms a discovery into a physical process. Machine tools then transform physical material, especially metal. They shape, they cut, they fabricate materials. They use different processes like cutting and grinding and shearing and boring. You know, today they use lasers. We didn't have those back in World War II. I mean, they create parts with very precise shapes and very precise sizes. They really they're the machines that make the other machines. They're absolutely foundational. And, you know, think about the complexity. Think about the complexity of an aircraft. You know, everything from its propulsion system to the materials involved in it, to its propellers. Well, we don't have propellers today, but we did in World War II, to the shape of the wings, you know, to all the different parts. A huge amount of machine tools go into machining the components for any complicated, you know, modern piece of equipment. And the experience of the people in the automotive industry was really fundamental to this, which is why Knudsen and his ties to the rest of the auto industry were so important for the World War II mobilization. As early as 1910, the auto industry made up 30% of machine tool sales. And of course, you know, this was an industry which was rapidly transforming, which means you had to constantly be coming up with new tools, new, you know, dealing with new prototypes, solving new problems, and so on. And it took an enormous amount of machine tools. I mean, this is a pretty stunning statistic. Ford alone eventually had more than 50,000 machine tools in its River Rouge assembly plant, which is about 8 miles from where I'm sitting right now, roughly as many machine tools as the entire United States made in an entire year. So again, this is why Knudsen was crucial, because before you can start building anything, you have to have the machine tools. You have to retool for new kinds of production that you'd never done before. And it was critical that he was brought in May 1940, because before you could start the actual war production, you had to have the machine tools. I'm going to share the screen again. Oops, no, I'm not. Try it again. These are two quotes from Knudsen on the importance of machine tools. He said, people seem to think that you get money on the 1st of July and that by the 15th, the guns are sprouting right out of the ground. It takes a year at the very least, with overtime 10 months to tool for an airplane motor. It takes a little over a year to tool for a medium tank. So our problem is first to get the best skills for that particular piece. Second, to get the facilities where facilities are required as quickly as possible. Third, to Shanghai the machine tools we require. And fourth, to sit down and pray to God that everything will be running all right. And then another quote. The absolute indispensable factor is speed. We need, particularly during the tooling period, all the effort you can give us. Builder, machine manufacturer, and engineer. We need your strength as never needed before. After we get the tools, the machines will turn out the stuff. And with a real appreciation for the American worker, he said, the American worker fundamentally loves to see the shop run. If we can get him tooled up right, he will produce the stuff. Now, remember those quotes. Remember those quotes when you start to hear people yapping about how Donald Trump hasn't delivered on his economic recovery yet. Because it's very heartening to know that people are looking at this book and that you have people like Elon Musk who lives and breathes this kind of thing, because it is going to take this kind of foundational work to lay the basis for transforming the United States into a manufacturing superpower. Now, there were obviously people who stayed in the private sector who didn't join the government as Knudsen did, who were equally important to this process. And one of them was a man named Fred Geyer, and I'm going to share the screen again, who was the head of the Machine Tool Builders Association. He was the president of the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company. Interesting guy. He spoke, apparently, he read Latin and Greek fluently. Obviously kind of a Renaissance man. He had been in Europe in the 1930s in Germany, and he saw what Hitler was doing, and he knew war was inevitable. And he did not wait for the 1940 war mobilization. He came back to the United States and he dramatically expanded his plant's capacity in Cincinnati. And during the war, his company was producing a new machine tool every 17 minutes, a new machine tool. And under his leadership, as this says, total American machine tool production nearly doubled before the end of 1941. Actually, I think it was larger than that. I've seen conflicting figures on that. Now, here's a couple of examples of how this process worked. Chrysler took up the challenge of building tanks. And again, all of this is before we entered the war. In 1940, the British came to the United States. They needed tanks. And of course, we wanted to start building our own tanks. They wanted 1,000 a month, and we wanted to start building tanks as well. At the time, our national production was 13 tanks per month nationwide. So the British came, they sat down with Knudsen, and they suggested, how about Baldwin locomotives to do this? I don't know, maybe because locomotives look like big tanks. I don't know. And Knudsen said no. I mean, these things are not built on mass production. He said, instead, get me Detroit. And he called the head of Chrysler, K.T. Keller, and said, I need you to do something that's never been done before. And he said, when do we start? And started very quickly. But there's a beautiful description of one of the key machine tool guys from Chrysler, who played a critical role in this tank production. And he was considered a genius in machine tool construction. And I want to read the quote. I don't have a slide for it, but his name was Edward Hunt. And it said, he could read a blueprint like a conductor reads a musical score, seeing not merely what was on the blueprint, but what was in it. And the tank had 3,500 parts. Some were simple, some required as many as 15 different operations to make. Some could be made on standard machines. Others had to have specialized machines designed and built. And this guy, Hunt, in his head, could calculate how many machines of what size were needed. And then he figured out the size of the building required to house them, along with assembly lines, railroad tracks, receiving station, and other essentials. That building turned out to be 1/4 of a mile long and 1/10 of a mile wide. I assume that's the Warren Tank Plant, which still exists up here north of Detroit. And there were other examples of this. Packard Motor took on the question of building engines for the Spitfire, and began to produce them at a rate, I think, 5 times faster than they'd ever been produced before. And some of these corporate heads accepted the job and were already underway with plans and construction and so on within days sometimes. And that engine, which Packard mass produced, also ended up going into PT boats and the P-52 Mustangs and so on, and again, played a critical role in our ability to win the war in the shortest time possible. That was one of the things that drove Knudsen, is that he wanted the war to end as rapidly as possible to save as many lives as possible. Now, of course, the most famous assembly line story is the story of Willow Run and the Liberator bombers, the B-24s. I've told it before. Many people have told it. There's whole chapters on it in Herman's book, and I'm not going to tell it again, but just the punchline in case people don't remember it, which is at the peak of production, Willow Run was chunking out one Liberator bomber every 57 minutes. So this deals with the builder producer side of the war mobilization. Now, there's another side to this, and it's the financing side of it. Now, there's an interesting quote at the end of the book, the concluding chapter of Freedom's Forge, which really struck me. As Herman says, Washington didn't have to command or ride herd over the American economy to achieve new heights of production, even after decades of depression. All you had to do was put in the orders, finance the plant expansion, then stand back and let things happen. Excuse me. Now, the important thing there is finance the plant expansion. Who was going to do that? Guess what? It largely was not going to be Wall Street. It was not going to be based on shareholder values. I want to give you an earlier example of the difference between the producer mentality and the Wall Street mentality. In the early days of the Ford Motor Company, the Dodge brothers were shareholders and on the board of directors because of the amount of shares they held of the Ford Motor Company. When Ford wanted to build the Highland Park plant, in other words, take the profits that they've made from the Model T and so on, and plow it into building the first assembly line in the world, the Dodge brothers balked because they wanted to get their profits. So Ford did the obvious. He just bought them out so that they couldn't get in his way. Fortunately, Ford had the wherewithal to do this expansion on his own. He didn't have to go to Wall Street. In fact, his hatred of Wall Street was pretty legendary. But most people, and certainly these small machine tool shops, did not have the wherewithal to finance expansion, to finance retooling, to do all of these things without some kind of reliable financing. And that's where the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, again headed by Jesse Jones, came in. Among its subsidiaries, it had a number of subsidiaries, was the Defense Plant Corporation. And this was absolutely critical. Because look, you're a small machine tool operation. You may be asked to design machine tools for a prototype, which ends up getting scrapped. Or ultimately, you hope the war is going to end and we're going to win. And all the work that you've done in terms of defense production, is going to end up not doing you any good. So you had to have the kind of financing and the changes in the tax code around depreciation and amortization, so that especially these smaller operations had some kind of stability in terms of financing and, some ability to continue to not go bankrupt and make a profit, both during the war production period and afterwards. And Knudsen was one of the key people who went to bat for these kinds of changes for industry to do this, both small and large. Now, he did run into new dealers who did not like corporations. And not all new dealers didn't, but there were some who did. And he basically was immediately on the target list as soon as he was hired in 1940 and throughout. 40 in 1941, he was on the target list of a lot of these people. And believe it or not, he actually got fired. Knudsen got fired as the head of the the Office of Production Management right after Pearl Harbor. Now, he had already done a huge service, because that 18-month period between his hiring in May 1940 and Pearl Harbor, the tooling up that he described, laid the foundation for the arsenal of democracy. But he was devastated because he knew the job wasn't done. And Jesse Jones, the ultimate New Dealer, but who did not have the problems of some of the other New Dealers, was a good friend of Knudsen and was critical in terms of this. He went to see Knudsen the night he was fired, spent several hours with him, trying to get his mind off it somehow because he was devastated. But then he and a couple of other people who knew how valuable Knudsen was convinced Franklin Roosevelt to bring Knudsen back in a new capacity. And as a civilian, he was given a lieutenant general commission, 3-star general, as a civilian. I think it's the first time and probably the only time in history that happened, so that he could continue to serve his country as the head of Army War Production. And because the Air Force was still under the Army at that point, that involved not only tanks and ammunition, but obviously the critical component of our aircraft. And it meant Knudsen was in the position he needed to be in to help in the final phase of getting the B-29 Superfortress off the ground and into the air before the war ended. So what was the economic result of all of this? First of all, between 1938, which was sort of the bottom of our economic production, and 1942, machine tool production increased from 34,000 units per year to 300,000, almost an entire order of magnitude increase in machine tool production. And that was the biggest jump, because as Knudsen keeps making clear, you got to get the machine tools in the first phase of this thing. Over the next 4 years, machine tool production then doubled again. And the total wartime production over the course of World War II itself, we produced approximately 800,000 machine tools. Now I've got another graph I want to share. It just gives you a sense of this incredible shift. This is a chart which shows machine tool production starting in 1925. You can see the depths of the depression here in 33. You can see the downturn again in the 37-38 Wall Street induced recession depression. And then 1940, here's when Bill Knudsen comes in. And you see this thing skyrocket. And that is why we actually won World War II. Now, the overall effect of this on the whole economy was that total economic production doubled, wages rose by 70%, American workers were twice as productive as their German counterparts and 4 times more productive than the Japanese. So we can do this again. We're going to have to do it again. I mean, it's going to be different. Obviously, machine tools are different today than they were then. We've got lasers, we've got CNC machining, computer numerical control machining, new technologies, and obviously newer challenges in terms of rebuilding an economy or making a manufacturing superpower in the 21st century. But what I find really exciting is that you have a Trump team which is thinking in these terms. You know, they're reading books like Freedom's Forge. They're focusing on a different metric for economic progress, raising wages, rising living standards, protecting our workforce. J.D. Vance keeps talking about one of my favorite themes, where one income can actually support a family. New technologies. Obviously, you've got people like Elon Musk, who loves building things and doesn't care if his rockets blow up because it teaches him something about the universe so he can build a better one, and pushing the actual frontiers. So in conclusion, I just want to show two more things, because I think this is a good time to revive a pedagogical device that Lyndon LaRouche gave us many decades ago, called the triple curve. Because I think as people begin thinking in terms of this new language of production that Trump and his team are giving us, that this pedagogical image and the one which follows it, I think is very useful to revive at this point. What this shows is the rates of change of these three parameters. And it basically shows what we've been doing for the last decades, that the rate of collapse of our physical economic input and output has been accelerating. LaRouche revised these upper two curves a little bit, given the kind of hyperinflationary period we're in right now, but I'm not going to go through that. Just to make the point that while physical economic output's rate is collapsing, the rate of increase of monetary aggregates and the rate of increase of financial aggregates, like derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, just paper speculating on paper, which is even crazier than the pure issuance of, Federal Reserve printed money, has been increasing at a hyperbolic rate. And most of the discussions that we've had, that the way most people think about economics over the past 30 to 40 years has been on the top part of this graph. You listen to the radio, you get the Wall Street report. It's all about money. And of course, what this really represents is how the monetary and financial side has parasitized our physical economic output. And this is what the Trump team is actually dealing with at this point. Here's where you want to go. And I think this is what they're grappling with, where the rate of increase of physical production is increasing faster than monetary issuance or financial aggregates. This is what I mean by a new language, where this is what is primary, production. These are just tools and a means to an end. Now, this is a real challenge. And our friend Mike Steger is, I think, preparing a short video, which is going to address the fact that there's other interesting discussions going on in the Trump administration in terms of how to deal with this systemic financial crisis. But what I wanted to do tonight was get people more used to the physical economic production side of this. And there certainly is no better example of a whole of economy mobilization as what happened in World War II. So I really enjoy this book, Freedom's Forge. I encourage other people who like this kind of stuff to get a copy of it and read it, because I think you'll enjoy it too. And I'm ready to open it up for discussion.